Mark Henry. Mark's just completed some research which is included in your folder about Australia's agricultural trade performance over the last 10 or 15 years. So it does provide some context to some of the discussion about what trade agreements might mean and where Australia sits in relation to it. So please welcome Mark.
Good morning. So I was just saying that was working. Well, it was felt a review of Australia's agricultural trade data was required. Now, this isn't going to push the frontiers of trade research, but hopefully this will provide a pretty comprehensive overview of Australia's trade performance. All right, let's get into it. It was working. Right, this report will be broken up into 3 sections. Part 1 will be an overview of Australia's agricultural export trade data, firstly by destinations and secondly by commodity compositions. Part 2 will look at Australia's performance by region as well as those of its major competitors. Because time is limited, we'll stick to just the major 3, North Asia, the ASEAN bloc, and a little bit of Africa and Middle East. Part 3 will look at the data surrounding meat imports to the ASEAN group as that region industrialises and domestic consumption increases, as well as production methods become more sophisticated. All right, let's begin very generally. In 2013, Australian agricultural exports by destination were $38 billion, and I'll need to preface this number. The definition of agriculture is quite hard to pin down, particularly when you're talking about the value of exports. It's very difficult to disaggregate the value of the value-added process post the farm gate. As a result of this $38 billion does include low-level processes. To give you an example, and probably in light of the speech last night, this does include dairy products such as cheese and powdered milk. Another one which is probably quite significant is malted barley. That $38 billion includes the value of the malted barley. It doesn't disaggregate out of the value added from the malting process. In terms of where it gets sent, 37% currently goes to North Asia. North Asia has been the major group for several decades now. Africa, the Middle East and Asia are increasingly so, and less of a share of Australia's agricultural exports go to the North Atlantic powers. That $38 billion represents around about 3.5% of total agricultural trade. That includes intra-regional trade, although it does exclude the intra-EU trade. This represents a modest decline from the late 90s, where it was around about 4.5%. And to put that in another way, we can look at compound annual growth rates over that period. Australian exports grew in US nominal terms by 7%, and also quickly, and I probably should have mentioned before this, apologies, this data is UN Comtrade data in case you want to take notes. The world annual growth rate is 8%, which is the reason why you see the moderate decline in Australia's export share. If you look at the growth rates by region, the picture is a little bit grimmer. Oceania is the only region in which Australia's exports are growing faster than the rest of the world. In fact, often it's quite significantly less. And the reason you do see this compared to the rather moderate lag compared to the total world exports is Australia is sending a disproportionate amount of exports to emerging markets with higher absolute growth. And probably the best example of this is the ASEAN region. ASEAN imports are growing at 12%, ASEAN imports from Australia are growing at 9%. This 9%, however, is still larger than the 8% world growth rate overall. Australia sends around about 20% of its product to the ASEAN region. ASEAN imports represent around 10% of world agricultural trade, so there is a little bit of a disconnect there. So what are we sending? These are top 5 commodities, and I've been a little bit loose with these definitions. For example, wheat does include wheat and mesclun. Beef includes, this beef definition doesn't include beef offal, but generally you get a pretty accurate picture of what our major commodities are worldwide. The first 2, wheat and beef, the major ones, are fairly entrenched as our major exports. Wool is our third largest commodity still, although it's been declining very swiftly since the latter half of the 20th century. And wine rounds up the top 5, although there is a swathe of commodities just under wine, such as barley, sugar, and I think canola is around about 1.8 billion. Let's move on to part 2, Australia's regional export performance, starting with North Asia. Now, I'm not sure if you can see the y-axis at the back, but it's the share of the North Asian agricultural imports, and it's done by region. countries and also the interregional trade. The time series goes from 1996 to 2012. Australia's share is currently around about 6%. It was around about 7%. It's declined modestly. And in terms of growth rates, Australia's growth of agricultural exports in nominal US dollars grew at 7%. This compares to the world growth rate of 8%, very similar to the world growth rates overall. Brazil has been a major accumulator of market share. And the reason behind this is soybean exports. In 2013, 67% of imports from Brazil were soybeans. To put in growth rate, that's 31% per annum over that period. And nearly all of these went to China. As China industrialized in 2000, the consumption of meat went up, and they largely met this consumption through domestic production. That meant importing a lot of feed grains. Soybeans are primarily grown for feed grains. The other mechanism is, as the agricultural sector industrialized along with the rest of the economy, processors moved away from household husbandry to larger scale commercialized operations, which are much more feed intensive. And I'll quickly point out with North Asia, there's very disparate growth between the constituent countries. China began emerging around about 2000s, late 1990s, depending on what you want to take, whereas South Korea and Japan were industrialized by that point. Actually, there's a little bit of flexibility with South Korea, but essentially they were very different growth paths over this time series. This affects not only the growth rates of commodities, but it also affects the commodity composition. Soybeans being one example. The other example, which is particularly relevant to Australia, is wool. Prior to 1996, the wool exports were largely going to Japan and South Korea as their textile industries were still existed. They left. They were left as industrialized, as textile industries tend to do in industrialized countries, to lower economic growth markets such as China. So now all our wool does go to China within the North Asia region. Breaking up Australia's commodity market share into North Asia, the y-axis is Australian share of imports by commodity. Again, the time series is 1996 to 2013. We'll start with our two biggest ones, meat and offal and cereals. Together they make up 42% of a share of Australia's exports. The table on the right has the growth rates of Australia's commodities into North Asia and the world growth rates into North Asia. As you can see, meat and offal exports have been from Australia have been slightly exceeding the world growth rate. There was a spike in Australia's share of meat exports around the early 2000s. I should probably point this out because it's quite significant. This coincides with export restrictions from the Americas and the UK. There's an outbreak of BSE and foot and mouth disease. As exports resumed, and they nearly all have resumed, I think there may be a portion of Brazil in which exports are still banned, this returned to trend. Next up is wool, and this one is slightly misleading, so I will spend some time on this one. In 1996, Australia's share of wool exports to North Asia, and even by this time this was still mainly China, this increased to 45% to 2013. What this doesn't capture is the domestic production of China's wool markets fueling its own consumption. In terms of exports, Australia's market share increased from 25% to 45%. However, at the same time, the share of imports fueling China's consumption decreased relative to their own production. Next up is cotton. And cotton is one of the success stories in North Asia. Unfortunately, this is more representative of trade diversion rather than domestic production in Australia. In 2009, the share of Australian cotton into China increased dramatically. The reverse of this, and we'll see this in a second, is that cotton exports to the ASEAN region, which decreased at around about the same time. There's no definitive answer to this, but it should be noted, around about this time, China did increase its certification standards, which would tend to favour more heavily regulated markets such as Australia and the US, rather than the subcontinental producers such as Pakistan and India. And lastly, I'll mention briefly oilseeds, because this one probably could be broken down further, and it is broken down further in the report, but not in this presentation. The 16% growth rate of world exports of oilseeds is primarily due to soybeans. Australia's is primarily due to canola, and while they are both soybeans, they're for very different markets. The soybeans are grown, they're both oilseeds. The soybeans are grown for animal feed primarily, although there is a component of human consumption. Canola is primarily grown for human consumption. So they are fueling two different markets. And if there's probably one key takeaway from the North Asian trade, and in fact a lot of the Asian trade generally, is that Australia does not export animal feed products. It doesn't really export soybeans, not at a significant level, and that's really weighing on total agricultural trade. Sorry, my mouth is really dry. All right, let's go and move on to ASEAN. Australia's share has declined, and we'll look at the commodities in just a bit. The thing I'd bring up is probably Brazil's accumulation of share, and this is again tied into the animal feed market. And with Brazil in particular, it's basically soybeans. I mean, they do grow a little bit of rutabagas and hay, but you can read soybeans into that. The other region I'd point out is Asia's share of growth, and that's been the other major accumulator. And there's a couple of things going on here. One is the establishment of the Asian FTA, which did help things along in terms of service, and I think Alan touched on that earlier, and that's probably affected it. The other factor that I think should be mentioned is as the ASEAN region industrialized, commodity growers tend to specialize within countries. Probably the best example, the most well-known example, of the palm oil plantations in Indonesia and Malaysia. It also affects things like meat. As soybeans become imported into the country, there's larger scale commercialized operations as meat, and we're starting to see now some inter-regional trade in things like chickens, or chicken meat rather than live chickens. Australia's commodities to the ASEAN region. On the y-axis, it's the same deal as the North Asian group. It's Australian share of imports by its major commodities. Again, cereal and meat are doing quite well. They're matching, if not slightly exceeding, the world agricultural trade, and they're really driving Australia's agricultural performance into the Asian markets. There was a spike in the cereal imports around about 2004, 2003, and it strikes me something I should comment on because it's very volatile. There's no definitive answer to this, but they roughly match up to drought years. But again, that's something that could be looked at further. Again, we'll look at cotton, and we mentioned with North Asia. As North Asia increased, ASEAN tend to decline. The years don't quite match up, but predominantly this is due to trade diversion. The most interesting commodity, I think, within the ASEAN group, particularly in light of the speech last night, is dairy. I think Gary mentioned dairy's lost decade, and this really shows up when you look at the ASEAN group, and in fact the African and Middle Eastern group when we get onto it in a couple of slides. Australia's share of dairy exports to the ASEAN group was 35% in the late 90s. This is now down to 15%. Moving on to Africa and the Middle East. Australia is not a big player in this, it's around about 2%. Again, I'd probably get the key competitor in Africa and Middle East to look at is probably Brazil. Its share grew from 4% up to 12%, this time from cereal, which shows it's not just soybeans it's competing on. So Brazil recently has really had a lot of success in exports. Running through the notes, the total exports in 2012 to Africa and the Middle East were US 70 billion. That's in nominal US dollars. Australia between 1999 and 2013, the growth of exports was 11% per annum. And the USA really lost a lot of market share. US tobacco exports declined by 16% per annum. This isn't solely the reason, but certainly didn't help. Looking at Australia's commodities into Africa and the Middle East. On the y-axis again is the Australian share of imports by commodity. And the one commodity, and I won't go through all of them, but the one I'd like you to consider is dairy once again. Australia's share of exports into Africa and the Middle East was 10% in the late 90s. This is now down to 2%. The past decade hasn't been very poor in terms of market share for Australia, and that shows up in the data, not just at ASEAN and Africa and Middle East, but pretty much in all regions. And finally, we'll move on to part 3, ASEAN industrialization and meat supply. The correlation between dietary protein and countries industrializing and per capita incomes increasing has long been established. And we see the same thing happening in the ASEAN region. In 1999, the ASEAN GDP per capita is 1,100. I have left this in nominal dollars for consistency. That might annoy people, but here we are. The total meat consumption at that time, including poultry, was 18 kilos per capita per year. Currently, the Asian GDP per capita is up to 3,900, and total meat consumption is 29 kilos per capita per year. To put that in perspective, that's just under 2.5 times the per capita GDP of India, and just over half of the per capita GDP of China. If you take an advanced Asian nation, Japan's GDP per capita is 45,000. Its total meat consumption is 49 kilos per capita per year. And without delving into utility functions, hopefully that gives you some kind of picture of where the ASEAN region is on that curve. So let's look at the data pertaining to meat consumption. These are imports of soybeans. Now, soybeans aren't the only animal feed, and soybean and animal feed isn't only used for soybeans, but they do give a pretty good indication. Soybeans and soybean meal, which soybean meal is almost entirely used for animal feed, have been growing at around 19%. The corresponding total agricultural imports into the region is 14%. Their soybeans are growing much higher, and as of 2013, they're worth 18% of imports to the region. As ASEAN imports its soybeans and grows its domestic meat production, this doesn't affect all meat products equally. This graph looks at Asian pig meat supply, and we've moved away from nominal values and we're looking at volumes, and this time the y-axis, in case you can't read it, is pig carcass weight equivalent, thousands of tonnes. The red lines are total domestic pig meat production of the ASEAN region. The blue lines, which are the small lines, you might not be able to see them, are total pig meat imports. The time series goes from 1996 to 2013, and it's forecast out to 2023. The data comes from the OECD FAO agricultural forecast, and it's time series banks before 2013. As you can see, all the meat supply into Asia, and almost all the meat supply into Asia, is coming from domestic pig meat production. If we look at chickens, and it's the same graph again, except with chicken instead of pig, there are some imports starting to occur, although a lot of this is intra-regional trades, but again, mainly it's coming from domestic production and fueling this production, or at least production growth, animal feed imports. Or mainly animal feed imports. They do grow some animal feed, but it is the animal feed fueling this market. And finally, we look at the beef supply, and beef is slightly different in that it's much harder to farm intensively. Broadacre beef production is much more economical relative to the first two, and this is largely the reason for the difference in supply. By 2022, in fact, it's forecast that the majority of the supply of beef is going to come from imports, and it's largely because of that reason. So this is pretty good news for Australian agriculture, as we are largely beef. In terms of meat exports, we are predominantly beef exporting relative to places like Europe and North America. So finally, there's probably three key takeaways I'd like you to take away from here. Firstly, Australia has a disproportionate share of exports going to emerging markets, which is quite good generally, but it does harm regional export share. And overall, Australia's losing export share. We're not keeping up generally, except for Oceania. And probably the big one in terms of Australia's agricultural trade is its lack of soybean and animal feed exports. And also, it's a very small production base as well, even domestically. And it really leaves it unable to capitalise on the increased domestic production of meat in emerging markets, particularly in Asia and ASEAN and China. And the flip side of this, there's some slight positive news out of this. Beef cattle, as we sort of looked at last slide, are relatively less economical to breed domestically within emerging markets. So they are slightly favoured as an import product relative to other meat products. And finally, just a little quick plug. The repository of data, so the commentary as well alongside it, is up on our website. It was up last night. You probably can't read that, but you should be able to find a link on our webpage. So, thank you very much.